Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower faced an impossible contradiction throughout World War II. He commanded the man he could never publicly praise. He disciplined the officer he privately considered essential. And when that officer died in a hospital bed in December 1945, Eisenhower finally spoke the truth he'd been forced to hide for years. Two young officers stood in the Texas dust of 1919, debating the future of warfare. They were both captains then, assigned to an experimental tank unit that the Army barely took seriously. One was a wealthy patrician who'd already seen combat in 2 wars. The other was a Midwestern farm boy who'd spent the Great War training troops stateside, watching others earn the glory he craved. George Patton came from the California aristocracy. His family's money gave him the freedom to speak boldly, to challenge superiors, to risk his career for his convictions. Dwight Eisenhower needed his paycheck. He had a wife to support and no safety net. While both men shared the same radical vision for mechanized warfare, only one could afford to be reckless about expressing it. They spent months together at Camp Meade, tearing apart tank engines, conducting unauthorized field tests, writing papers that their superiors dismissed as fantasy. Both understood that tanks would revolutionize combat. Speed and mobility would replace the static trench warfare that had consumed a generation. The Army's leadership disagreed violently. They warned both officers to stop wasting time on theoretical nonsense or face professional consequences. Patton continued pushing. Eisenhower learned discretion. That difference would define their relationship for the next 26 years. By 1943, the Kansas farm boy commanded all Allied forces in Europe. The California aristocrat led armies into battle under his orders. Their friendship remained, but everything else had undergone a fundamental change. Eisenhower now bore responsibility for military strategy, diplomatic relations, and political consequences. Patton wanted only to fight. The tension erupted in Sicily during the summer offensive. Patton visited field hospitals where he encountered soldiers whose minds had broken under combat stress. Medicine would later recognize their trauma as legitimate psychological injury. Patton saw cowardice. In 2 separate incidents, he physically struck soldiers, verbally abused them, and threatened to execute them for weakness. News of these attacks rapidly spread. Journalists learned details. Politicians demanded accountability. Public outrage built pressure that threatened to end Patton's career instantly. Eisenhower received calls from Washington insisting on immediate dismissal. The Supreme Commander chose a path that satisfied no one completely but preserved what he needed most. He issued formal reprimands. He ordered Patton to apologize publicly to the soldiers, medical staff, and his entire army. He made the punishment visible enough to quiet critics while stopping short of removal. Why protect an officer who'd committed such clear violations? Because Eisenhower was already planning the invasion of France, and he understood with absolute clarity that Patton possessed capabilities no other American commander could match. In Sicily, Patton's 7th Army had swept across the island with devastating speed, while British forces under Montgomery moved with methodical caution. German commanders learned to fear Patton's unpredictability and aggression. Eisenhower defended his decision to the Army Chief of Staff George Marshall, to President Roosevelt, to the War Department. He promised oversight, control, and prevention of future incidents. What he couldn't say publicly was darker and more honest. He understood Patton's fury at combat breakdown, even if he condemned the violent response. Wars required men who could endure unendurable conditions. Discipline and mental toughness weren't optional qualities. Patton's method was indefensible, but his underlying conviction wasn't entirely wrong. So Eisenhower saved Patton's career and buried his private doubts under layers of diplomatic necessity. Spring 1944 brought Eisenhower's most audacious use of Patton's reputation. The Normandy invasion required German forces to believe the attack would come elsewhere. Allied intelligence designed Operation Fortitude, an elaborate deception centered on a phantom army group supposedly preparing to invade Pas-de-Calais. Eisenhower placed Patton in command of this fictional force. The choice was strategic brilliance. German intelligence services had studied Patton obsessively after North Africa and Sicily. They considered him the Allies' most dangerous commander. They tracked his movements religiously, convinced that wherever Patton appeared, the real attack would follow. Patton inspected inflatable tanks and plywood landing craft. He delivered speeches to non-existent units. German reconnaissance photographed the fake installations and reported massive force concentrations in southern England opposite Calais. Wehrmacht leadership kept entire divisions positioned there for weeks after D-Day began, waiting for Patton's real invasion. The deception succeeded beyond expectations, but it devastated Patton emotionally. While other generals earned glory on Normandy's beaches, he played actor for a phantom army. He felt humiliated, wasted, and deliberately sidelined during history's most important battle. Eisenhower couldn't explain the full truth, that Patton's fearsome reputation was saving thousands of Allied lives by keeping German reserves away from the actual landing zones. Patton learned the complete scope of Operation Fortitude only after the war ended. The knowledge didn't ease his resentment. August 1944 finally brought Patton's Third Army into operational status. What followed redefined modern warfare's possibilities. In 30 days, Patton's forces advanced further than any comparable army in military history. They liberated hundreds of French communities. They destroyed or captured tens of thousands of German soldiers. They moved so rapidly that enemy commanders couldn't establish defensive positions before American tanks smashed through them. Eisenhower watched with conflicting emotions. Pride at seeing their 1919 theories about mobile warfare vindicated so spectacularly. Anxiety because Patton was outrunning supply lines and creating massive coordination problems with other Allied forces. Other commanders couldn't match that pace. Omar Bradley moved methodically, consolidating each gain before advancing. Montgomery refused to attack until every detail achieved perfection. But Patton simply moved forward relentlessly, calling headquarters constantly to demand more fuel and ammunition. "Give me the supplies and I'll be in Berlin within 2 weeks," he'd insist. Eisenhower had to explain complications that Patton refused to acknowledge. Other armies required resources too. Political considerations mattered. Soviet agreements about occupation zones couldn't be ignored. Patton dismissed all of it as bureaucratic interference. He saw the German army crumbling and wanted to deliver the killing blow before they could recover. Every delayed day felt like a wasted opportunity. Privately, Eisenhower sometimes agreed. In conversations with his chief of staff, he'd admit that Patton might be right, that perhaps excessive caution was replacing military logic with political calculation. But as supreme commander, Eisenhower bore responsibilities beyond battlefield effectiveness. He managed an alliance of nations with competing interests. He balanced American, British, and Soviet priorities. He had to consider the post-war world, not just the current battle's outcome. So he held Patton back. He diverted supplies to support Montgomery's Operation Market Garden, which failed catastrophically. He ordered Patton to slow down, consolidate positions, and coordinate with adjacent forces. Patton was furious, convinced Eisenhower was squandering the war's best opportunity to force German surrender. Their relationship became openly hostile. December 16, 1944, shattered every assumption about the war's final phase. German forces launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest. American units were caught completely unprepared. Entire divisions became surrounded. Front lines collapsed. For the first time since Normandy, Allied commanders faced the possibility of losing ground. Eisenhower convened an emergency conference at Verdun. His top commanders gathered in grim silence. Bradley appeared shaken. Montgomery advocated characteristic caution. Other generals discussed defensive positions and waiting for reinforcements. Eisenhower turned to Patton with a simple question. How long will it take you to attack? Everyone in that room understood the magnitude of what he was asking. Patton's Third Army was positioned 90 degrees away from the German breakthrough, actively engaged in offensive operations to the south. Responding would require complete disengagement, pivoting his entire force, 3 divisions, tens of thousands of men, hundreds of tanks, and attacking through winter weather into the enemy's flank. The logistical complexity was staggering. Most commanders would need weeks. Patton pulled out a small notebook. He'd already wargamed this exact scenario during his train ride to Verdun. He looked directly at Eisenhower. December 22nd, 3 divisions, 72 hours. Other generals considered it impossible. Bradley looked skeptical, but Eisenhower knew Patton well enough to recognize he wasn't exaggerating. Make it so. On December 22nd, exactly as promised, 3 Third Army divisions slammed into the German southern flank. The attack blunted the enemy offensive and transformed the Battle of the Bulge from a potential disaster into Allied victory. This moment justified everything Eisenhower had endured, every controversy, every diplomatic headache, every time he defended or restrained or apologized for Patton. It all became worthwhile. Because when the crisis arrived, when everything was collapsing, Eisenhower turned to Patton and received what no one else could deliver. Throughout the war, Eisenhower's public statements about Patton remained carefully measured, complimentary but balanced, acknowledging contributions without elevating him above other commanders. Eisenhower commanded an alliance, not just an army. He had to maintain Montgomery's confidence, preserve Bradley's morale, and avoid showing favoritism that might damage coalition unity. But privately, Eisenhower knew the truth. In staff meetings discussing operational plans, he'd often ask, what would Patton do? Not because Patton was always correct, but because he thought differently from everyone else. While other commanders saw obstacles, Patton saw opportunities. While others calculated risks, Patton calculated how fast he could advance. Eisenhower's personal diary entries from 1944 and 1945 reveal his frustration with this contradiction. He needed Patton's aggression, but had to restrain it. He valued Patton's results, but had to apologize for his methods. He relied on Patton during crises, but couldn't admit it publicly. Victory in Europe transformed Patton from an asset to a liability overnight. His comments about former Nazi Party members created scandals. His advocacy for immediate conflict with the Soviet Union became politically toxic. The qualities that made him effective in war made him dangerous in peace. Eisenhower had to remove him from command, demoting his old friend, the general who'd saved the Bulge, the man who'd proven every theory they'd developed together at Camp Meade. It ranked among the hardest decisions he ever made. Their final conversations were strained and bitter. Patton felt betrayed. Eisenhower felt he had no alternative. Then came the car accident. 12 days later, Patton was gone. After Patton's death, Eisenhower's carefully maintained diplomatic mask finally cracked. In letters to friends, in conversations with staff members, in private moments documented by those around him, he spoke with raw honesty he'd never permitted himself during the war. He admitted that Patton achieved results through sheer speed, pressure, and force of personality, traits that couldn't be taught or replicated. Other generals commanded through planning and organization. Patton commanded through willpower alone. Eisenhower confessed that restraining Patton had been necessary for political reasons, not military ones. Some decisions to hold him back haunted him. Perhaps if he'd given Patton more freedom, the war would have ended sooner. He acknowledged that Patton thrived in chaos and uncertainty, the exact conditions where other commanders froze. When everything was going wrong, when decisions required instant action, Patton was at his absolute best. And Eisenhower said something revealing the core of their relationship. Managing Patton had been his command's hardest aspect, but also the most important. Because Patton needed management. Left unchecked, he would have created diplomatic disasters and political chaos. But properly directed, he was unstoppable. In his memoirs, years later, Eisenhower called Patton indispensable to the war effort. That word carries extraordinary weight. Indispensable means irreplaceable. It means the outcome would have been different without him. Eisenhower wrote that Patton was uniquely suited for war, but impossible to manage in peace. He didn't mean it as criticism. He meant it as recognition that some individuals are built for specific circumstances. Patton was built for war, for speed, for aggression, for breaking enemies through relentless pressure. In peacetime, those qualities had nowhere productive to go. They became liabilities instead of assets. Eisenhower became president in 1953, leading America through 8 dangerous Cold War years. He never fought another war, never commanded another army, but he never forgot Patton. In interviews late in life, he still discussed their friendship at Camp Meade, the impossible decisions managing him during the war, the Battle of the Bulge, and that moment when he needed someone who could achieve the impossible. The admission Eisenhower made after Patton died wasn't just about one general. It was about the burden of command, about the loneliness of restraining people you need, about the gap between military effectiveness and political acceptability. Eisenhower had been forced to manage genius, to protect Patton from himself and from others, to balance his value against his controversies. Only after Patton was gone could Eisenhower admit how much it had cost and how much it had been worth. America lost more than a general on December 21, 1945. It lost someone who could make impossible things happen through sheer force of will. Someone who thrived when everything was falling apart. Someone uniquely suited for war's chaos. Eisenhower knew it. He'd always known it, but only after Patton died could he finally say it without consequences.